Hello, my name is Chris Blask. I'm the Vice President of Strategy at Cybeats, and with me today is Tony Turner. How you doing, Tony?
I'm great, Chris. Thanks for having me.
You have just no. We normally don't do a lot of bio and background and stuff, but you just changed. So you were at Fortress, another supply chain company. Just started your own. What remind me the name and what are you guys up to?
Just launched Opswright. We're a security engineering focused product company servicing critical infrastructure.
It's never boring, is it? Right?
No, never is, never is. I think we have seen over the years, Chris, that the industry tends to focus on the wrong things at times, and there's rampant confusion about what we need to prioritize, what we need to work on. Um, and we're really just trying to get back to basics and trying to help folks focus on foundational security.
Well, and it's yeah, that's actually a really good setup to our ongoing theme here, transparency, right? So Cybeats does software supply chain stuff. We help people clarify what they're saying and doing and attesting to each other and whatnot. And but it's all a new area, right? You and I got involved with this because our each personal path. Every this is episode 39, right? 38 other sort of amazing folks. We had these conversations about how'd you get from there to here, and cybersecurity at all is a non-linear path. We can't be about our
Absolutely.
ages and started. There was no class, right? You all just got into it somehow, and then you get into OT and critical infrastructure, right? And which I'm just childlike enough to enjoy saying every time I say it, right? Critical infrastructure. Right? It's like having a job working inside an episode of Build It Bigger or something, right? It's like, what's that? Oh, it's a 500-pound bolt that goes on here to hold this 600-foot, right? Who gets to do that for a living? But to get us anywhere on topic, this issue of transparency, right? Supply chain stuff and all this conversation the last couple of years, is driving us down similar paths. We've been with threat intelligence and other things. Can we tell each other how much? Can we write it down? And can we put inventory information on paper, electronic paper, and so forth? So, Anthony, before I get entirely in the weeds, looking back, the first question, if you wouldn't mind putting that up, so look in your career, right, in this path, from the time you got involved in all this mess to where we are right now, how was it easier to see what was going on then? Are we less able to see what's knowing what you're doing with the new company? It's even more about seeing what you know, making those decisions. So
I think it's a little bit of both, to be frank. So I'll first start with kind of the blind spots that we had in the industry, years ago. I mean, I've been doing this stuff for, 20, 25 years now. Long before there was really a defined path, or I don't think the industry really knew what we were doing. We just knew that there were problems and we needed to address them. The abuse cases back then were a little different than what we see now. The profit models around cybercrime have evolved over time so that it's a real business, and the threat models have evolved with them. The landscape has changed, but I think our perception back then was much different. We didn't really know what we didn't know, so we just wanted to start somewhere. And then when you look at the topics of transparency, well, no one was really being transparent. We didn't really understand that that was a problem at the time. We just knew that we needed to get our hands around some of the issues. Fast forward to now, okay, we understand that transparency is a problem. We need to get more visibility, better control, um, reduce our attack surface, all these things that every CISO tends to focus on, so that they can secure their environment. But along with better understanding has also come much greater complexity in our technology footprint. The advent of cloud and mobile and all these things has meant that much of our technology is abstracted from the people that actually need to manage it. Things have become more separated, decentralized, and a lot of implicit trust has just been put in places because I can no longer put my hands around everything. I'm not just running a Unix server that's, serving up a DNS connection anymore. Now I have all these crazy things, the entire business, the digital transformation of business, connectedness between IT and OT. All these things are introducing rampant complexity, that is extremely challenging for, or impossible for any one person to really wrap their brain around.
You know, and that leads well to our next question. So Anthony, pop that one up there, right? You know, so it's you know, in this last week, so Rob Lab is chairing the Metals and Mining ISAC, and they had and I chair the ICS ISAC, and we had some conversation the week before, so I attended a webinar he had just a couple of days ago, and in the Q&A afterwards, I'm running my mouth as I do, and one of his members, the mining operator, right, you know, said, you know, the same sorts of things. How to, you know, not to repeat it all, I'll get it all wrong anyways, but the same sort of things, you know, you and I have heard for 20 years, right? But it's a new question for this individual, right? When they're saying, okay, I'm finally here, right? I mean, and we need to start, and it had a lot to do with communications and IT and OT teams and how you get people on the same page and how you get them to not interrupt your operations, you know, coming here with their stupid, you know, half-baked ideas when you've been running a facility for 30 years and it works all the time, right? And you know, this you know, you and I have talked a lot about these sort of things, right? You know, we're evolving. We're at a medium maturity level in cybersecurity writ large. You know, still very early in OT, right? Brand new in supply chain, right? You know, but and that's oversimplifying it because everybody in OT, which is, I don't know, most of the jobs on earth, 90% of them haven't heard of any of this yet, and we have these mismatched maturity levels all at the same time, with some of the leading edge trying to move things along. And so how bad is it now? Right. I am notoriously optimistic, right? But I think we work through these things. I think there's lots of things driving things forward right now. But again, just thinking about that webinar this week, there's so many people out there with so little visibility and where to even bloody start. Up to those of us who are like the leading edge of trying to figure out the crypto hash of the SBOM contents, right? What are your thoughts about the present? Where are we?
Well, so I do want to comment on one statement you just made about this whole supply chain space being brand new. I don't know that it really is, but I think it's evolved. Like last several years, I was working in a supply chain company, working in Fortress, having lots of conversations with Gartner, trying to figure out like, okay, how do we position ourselves as a supply chain risk management company in the marketplace? And I got a lot of confusion. Even from the Gartner analysts and some of the other people that should really know what a market or how a market is defined, and there was still a lot of legacy mentality around, oh, you mean vendor risk, right? It was vendor risk management. No, I mean supply chain risk management, which encompasses vendor risk. Yeah, it's a piece of it, but we've kind of evolved, and this whole concept of transparency has really kind of shifted us more to the product security side of the equation, right? And this all becomes, we're starting to realize, and especially with all the attacks that we're seeing, all the supply chain compromises, dependency confusion style attacks, and attacks especially against all the open source code that we use now. I mean, we're building applications differently now than we ever did before. We're using a larger degree of open source than we did 10, 20 years ago, before there even was such a thing as open source. And all of this has really caused us to have to rethink, what does our supply chain mean? I'll tell you, I was doing assessments, such the supply chain manufacturing facility assessments over a decade ago. And back then it was about intellectual property, right? So manufacturer is worried that their source code is blowing out the door and going to China, and that they're counterfeiting their stuff and are going to beat them in the market. It's more of an, industrial espionage kind of scenario where they're worried that they're going to lose competitive advantage because some foreign nation is stealing their IP. And so I spent a lot of time doing assessments in these areas. Security really was not something that was focused on at all in these places. Physical security was very strong in many of these facilities. You show up, there's a guy at the door with a machine gun. He wants to see your passport. He's checking, doing all the right things from a physical security standpoint. And you walk to the front door, and there's exposed Wi-Fi all over the place, and USB ports are exposed, there's shared credentials. And some of this, it was really kind of just the byproduct of how the factory needed to operate, right? It was challenging to apply traditional IT-centric controls into the OT environment for manufacturing. But fast forward to where we are now, those issues still exist, obviously, in the OT space. But we have a lot more people that are paying attention to how open source is creating a problem for us, and how software is creating a problem for us, and even hardware to some degree. Folks focusing more on how does whether it's a secure equipment delivery concern because it's backdoor, because it's counterfeit, because it's some other issue, regulatory compliance issues coming out of our federal government, the NDAA issues. All this is causing people to pay a lot more attention to what is going on in our landscape today.
Well, and you keyed on part of this I wanted to talk about going forward, because I stand by my statements. The supply chain security is brand new. However, immediately you started saying there's been people doing this for 10 and 20 years, right? There's been small groups, right? And OT has so many lessons for IT because, again, IT is a couple decades old, right? OT is thousands of years old, process and guilds, and here's how we do it, and here's the diligence and everything else. And we put these things together, and nothing comes across you really, suddenly. One of the things I found out over the last 30 years, right? 30 years ago, I drew on a napkin I found out after lunch was called a firewall, right? So technically I invented this firewall, and for marketing purposes, that's a term, the phrase that works well. And then I started getting introduced as the person who invented the firewall. And I'd get up on stage and I say, well, to be clear, I didn't, right? Marcus Raynham wrote the firewall toolkit, and you could put it on him as much as possible. But Marcus didn't either, really, right? You talk to older timers, and firewalls and edge defenses and so forth go back forever. And, to my ranting point here, literally back in the physical world for thousands of years. So nothing's really new. This isn't really coming, it's news. Software supply chain security, and the fact you have to do anything about it is going to be news to a lot of organizations and individuals in the next couple of years. And there's a lot of work to do. But we have a lot of groundwork done. Last couple of years has been good, where I met you in the SBOM working groups and so on and so forth. Good folks, good effort, good groundwork. We're still figuring things out. But it's built on, decades at least, hundreds of years in some cases thousands of years of human and social and business processes, right? So looking forward, and in the third question, Anthony and I put these shows together, and we think about it. How do we, how do we make this work? And Anthony, if you put that one up, right, is the future appropriate, right? Because I think the problem with transparency is everybody's like, well, everybody's going to see everything all the time, and there's going to be no privacy. It's like, no. Appropriate transparency. Think about it. I have a business relationship with you. In contracts and agreements and handshakes, we said you will do this and I will do that. Transparency into that, lots and lots of it. It's good for everybody. So, on the Darwinian or Orwellian scale, where do you think all this transparency goes? Do we end up with appropriate, too much, too little?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is one of these annoying "it depends" answers, right? Depends on what industry you're in. Depends on which area of the world that you're in. What kinds of laws you're having to deal with, and that aspect of the world. Is licensing important to you in your geographic region, or is it not? Is it a business enabler, or is it a business limiter? For me, the topic of transparency comes down to a question of so what? Like, what do I do with this transparency, and how does it benefit me? I think we all agree that this whole concept of transparency is fantastic and great, and we want it. But I still see an awful lot of people that are asking for a software bill of materials in a very detailed, complete, excruciating detail in their SBOMs. And then I'll ask them, it's like, what do you plan to do with it? And they give me this blank stare. They don't know. They want transparency because they want transparency, but ultimately provides no value. So if the end consumer of that is not going to generate any value, but it creates risk and cost for the originating entity that needs to produce it, why would we do this in the first place? Now, I think we all realize that there is value. I think a lot of this is just confusion in the market right now. It's still very new, this concept. I mean, the concept of a software bill of materials or software inventory is not necessarily new, but in the current framing it is, right? People are still trying to wrap their brains around this. And Interestingly enough, when I talk to people, once you kind of start drawing it out of them, you start to realize, do they really want the software bill of materials, or do they want the attestation that answers the questions that the SPOM informs them? Now, you kind of go both ways, right? I know Cybeats sells a platform that provides this analysis for the customer, so they don't have to figure this stuff out, right? There's a bunch of other folks that are working in this space as well, and I think that's what's really necessary to drive this whole initiative forward. Um, if we just start piling, stacks of SPOM documents on somebody's desk, it just winds up becoming a paperweight, right? But if they can't figure out how to gain value from it, if they can't tie that value to other pieces of metadata inside their environment, it winds up being an issue. Asset inventory is one of my favorite things to poke at here. SPOMs are great; they're fantastic. They can answer lots of questions. Do I have a malicious component in my SPOM? If I can look the hash up and get some sort of hash match, provenance and pedigree and vulnerability identification and licensing risk and all these are great things. But if I don't know where that software is actually installed inside my environment, I have a really big problem. And the advent of this whole Log4j mess this last year, I worked with a multitude of entities that were trying to figure out where they had a Log4j problem. And a good chunk of it was, okay, which software products have vulnerable Log4j? But an even bigger problem was, I don't know where these software products are.
Right. And there's, a couple of things in that, right? I love the picture of, you take a book and you put it on a wooden desk. There is more information in the grain and coloring of the desk than there is in the book, right? And this is a defining characteristic of modern life. And as we're both talking about here, see, diving down into this, just, how much software inventory information do I need to run a water plant? How much could I have? It would hold my coffee, right? Oh my God, right? Every SBOM of every VEX to go with it, and every CB associated, and if all of that without the context of that's actually running in my plant and it's running on this device, which is in this context, what do I do with it, right? But we managed to get through life without sitting there staring at the surface of the desk, trying to figure out the binary characteristics of the wood grain, right? And I think this period is one of these, right, where we have that. It's almost a cycle. Every time we go through this information bump, we get all this, more information. We go, oh my God, what am I going to do with that? And after a while, we sort it out and find out that, I think you're exactly right. We didn't really want the information. We wanted to know that you're going to have that information if I need it, and help me know to need it. So,
yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And you raise a really important point around the context, right? So, knowing what asset it's on and why that asset is important. One of the examples I've used in the past in talking to some people, like part of the executive order's efforts was, getting a definition out of NIST as far as what is critical software. Okay, we want SBOMs on all the critical software. What does critical software mean? And it was really interesting. They went through this thought experiment to kind of figure out what is critical software. It puts packets on the wire. It has administrative capabilities, whatever, right? Like, okay, that's a reasonable approach until you realize that open source components get used everywhere for any purpose that you never even imagined that they would ever get used for, right? So I have some graphics rendering library that I use for kitten pictures on my blog. Okay, is that critical software? Probably not. But what if I use that graphics rendering library in a critical application like missile defense platform or telemetry data inside an ICS environment? Okay, now we're talking critical software. The software didn't change. The same code. But the application of it, how it was used, the value that it produced, how it relates to downstream impacts and consequences when that software ultimately gets compromised is a much, much different story. I'm glad to see that. I think the federal government has kind of backed up on this a little bit, and we've kind of heard rumors that, like, okay, we define critical software, but yeah, we know everything's critical software. So it's really kind of hard to put your finger on what is or is not critical. But like, as we've kind of seen this evolution of the software bill of materials movement. And you may know, Chris, I'm a longtime OWASP advocate. I've been an OWASP chapter leader for 11 years, run multiple OWASP projects. I'm a big fan of the Cyclone DX standard, just largely because it's a more security-focused approach, but also because it goes so much further than just software bill of materials. As some of the research we've been doing recently has been around threat modeling. Can I use software bill of materials or other kind of bombs to threat model the system? And it winds up being a really effective system description language. I can get hardware, I can get software. The concept of a SaaS bomb brings in concepts of APIs, but it's not just the APIs. I mean, it's we kind of notionally thought through this as like, okay, we want to describe our cloud infrastructure. But the thing you start to realize is you can describe any endpoint and any data flow. It's a unidirectional, it's a bidirectional, it's authenticated. What kind of data does it pass? Like, this is what you put in a data flow diagram when you're starting to threat model a system, right? Like the amount of information and the usage of all this stuff just grows exponentially.
And it's, I could talk with you all day, and often enough, not often enough, we need to do more of that. But I just, if I have to say to people, it's not an infinite regress, right? There's not an infinite number of. We're not going to constantly be finding a whole new field of data and information and challenges. There is a, it's a finite thing, but all these challenges right now are in front of us, and whether for security purposes or because you competitively need to lower your costs, in software development or whatever, we're all going down this path together. But it's not necessarily a tunnel with a light at the end of it, because that's too often trains. I think we'll probably make it. So Tony, thank you very much. Looking forward to see you out here on the boats again sometime. Look, S4. I'll see you in a couple of weeks down in Miami. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to coming out and seeing everybody, and see what's going on with the boats. It's fascinating, Chris. Absolutely fascinating.
Don't get me started. We'll come back to that at some other point. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Anthony. Thanks, Tony.